So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for the second session of our discussion forum. For this session, we have invited 3 curators to join with us today. We pitched this question to them. How does the exhibition context of a textile reframe its interpretation? Today, we will have Sharon Takeda, Senior Curator and Head of the Costume and Textiles Department at LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Jackie Yoon, Curator of Asian Fashion and Textiles and Peranakan Art at the Asian Civilizations Museum and Peranakan Museum in Singapore, and Yaroslav Volovat, Curator at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, to present various case studies on the topic. Sharon, please join me on stage.
Close enough, yeah. Thank you. Hope you all had a good lunch. I have a lot of slides to go through, so I'm going to move pretty quickly here. But this will kind of review the last 30 years or so of my career at the Los Angeles County Museum and the exhibitions that I've either done or looked over as head of the Department of Costume and Textiles. So the Los Angeles County Museum is placed right on the Pacific Rim. This is a photograph from 1965, which was the first new campus for the museum on Wilshire Boulevard, our current location. And it's the largest encyclopedic museum west of the Mississippi River in the United States. And the Costume and Textile Department there is the only encyclopedic collection within the Encyclopedic Museum, and consists of over 35,000 objects, including one of 2 16th century artible, 16th century Persian carpets, including the artible carpet you see here. This is a detail of the artible, and it is, of course, one of 2. Many of you probably know the one at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is constantly on display. Ours has not been constantly on display, so therefore the color is very intense and bright. We only show it occasionally for special installations, such as the Gifts of Sultans, or sometimes we've done exhibitions of it on its own. Our carpet is a little bit smaller than the Victoria and Albert because before it ours was donated to LACMA, or to the Los Angeles County Museum, by J. Paul Getty in the 1950s. Before it was in his hands and still in the dealer's hands, the carpet we have was, the border was taken over or out and given to the carpet that's now in the V&A to complete their border. So theirs is a little longer, or larger, but ours is smaller, and again, pretty close to the intense color. But J. Paul Getty gave this to us in the 50s before his idea of a museum was ever a glint in his eye. This is my first exhibition when art became fashion, Kosode in Edo period Japan, which was a major international loan exhibition in collaboration with the Tokyo National Museum and the National Museum of Japanese History. This is the entrance and title wall. We borrowed probably over 150 objects, primarily Kosode from the Momoyama period, but it really tracked the socioeconomic kind of culture that bred the samurai culture and the height of the merchant class. And even though the kimono form did not change, what did change was patterning, motifs, brought about by severe sumptuary laws by the Tokugawa shogunate. It was divided in both chronological and thematic. So we first went through the chronological changes of the kimono, and here you see very early Momoyama and Keicho period fragments that were laminated onto screens by the renowned collector and dealer Nomura Shojiro of Kyoto, and a very rare Keicho Kosode on the right, which has to be on a slant board. Everything that you borrow from the Japanese in exhibitions like this has to be behind plexiglass, and basically you have to curate 2 shows because everything has to rotate every 4 or 6 weeks. The thematic sections included things such as the seasons, and focused on motifs such as calligraphic designs on kimono, and even as you see on the left, hand-painted kosode by very famous artists. Oops. In 2001, my colleague, Kay Spilker, who's now retired, who was a pre-Columbian specialist, did dress codes, abstraction, and Wari textiles of Peru. And we always love to kind of talk about the pre-Columbian textiles in very modernistic terms because their motifs are so abstract that we often tell our contemporary collectors and curators that, you know, this was modernism or abstraction isn't anything new because this happened thousands of years before and it was harder to do. And then in 2002, my next major exhibition, which was Miracles of Mischief, Knowing Kyogen Theater in Japan, was co-organized between LACMA and the Ministry of Cultural Affairs of the government of Japan. And again, it was a major lone exhibition with a few select pieces from LACMA. It was organized first by types of costumes, and within the type of costumes, it was displayed chronologically. For the karaori section, which is a name of a type of no-robe, but also the type of cloth, which literally means, or translates as Chinese weave, we discuss the, what originated first, the Chinese fabric or the costume, and how did that all happen. We also borrowed craftsman screens that showed Edo period craftsmen at work doing spinning and weaving, and we also borrowed and showed weaving and spinning utensils or materials, tools. We also included, of course, masks, because you can't do No or Kyogen theater without them. There were a number of important cultural properties that came here, and again, even the mask had to rotate. We wanted people to understand the ensembles and what types of characters wore these ensembles. So in the last section where we showed painted scrolls showing famous theatrical performances, we showed on the right-hand case there musical instruments and songbooks dating from the very beginning, from the 15th century throughout and through the Edo period, and then cases of ensembles of specific characters and what their ensembles would look like and their role, both interior garments and the fast change that they would do for the change of characters. In 2004, we did Erte Opera and Ballet Russe, dance, theater costume in LACMA's collection. LACMA is one of the few institutions in the world with a sizable group of costumes from the historically and aesthetically important Ballet Russe, or Russian ballet. 22 ballet costumes designed by such artists as Henri Matisse, Natalia Goncharova, Sonia Delaunay, and Leon Basque were presented. These are costumes designed by Goncharova for for Le Coq or the Golden Cockerel in 1914. And we actually have the Golden Cockerel costume, which was recently loaned to the Goncharova retrospective at the Tate Modern in London. And we also featured in LACMA's exhibition 30 spectacular couture costumes created for opera singer Ghana Volska by the renowned fashion and graphic designer Erte. And here's Erte's costume sketch and costume for Ghana Volska as Zaza in Zaza from 1920. 2006-07, Breaking the Mode, Contemporary Fashion from the Permanent Collection, presented designers who found traditional criteria and solutions obsolete, designers who challenged the canons of the body's fashionable silhouette, revolutionized methods of garment construction, rejected the formulaic use of materials and techniques, and exploited new technology in textile production. There were over 100 ensembles in the exhibition. This is the beginning of the exhibition, which showed a brief synopsis of what was to follow in the change of the fashionable silhouette. From the right to left, we start with a 1950s structured look by Jean Dissay, and next to it, a also 1950s garment by Rudy Gernrich, which is knit, which shows only the natural body. There's no corseting or underpinnings of worn then or by his designs. And a 1980s Rei Kawakubo Comme des Garçons deconstructed dress, and a 1999 Issey Miyake and Dai Fujiwara APOC series, where we had both the double woven one piece of cloth you see on the extreme left, and then a diagram of how you can cut up along perforated lines to get a whole ensemble. There were 4 thematic sections in this: construction, materials, form, and concept. This is one of the first platforms of the construction. So you see in the middle, again, a 1950s very structured Dior gown. And then you see a Jean-Paul Gaultier dress where he basically, it's 2 layers, but the internal layer is twisted, and you're looking up into the dress on the detail here, and so it kind of creates its own form by the construction. And then Rei Kawakubo for Comme des Garçons, which also takes a hint from 1950s fashion, but then also takes hints from the Japanese kosode or kimono with its padded hem, and of course from Japanese ink-painted screens and paintings of the design of pine tree. Moving into the construction area, we actually showed detailed photographs of construction. And here we have a piece by Rei Kawakubo for Comme des Garçons, a 2005 spring-summer jacket, which still seems to be in the construction phase, but is actually finished. And also Junya Watanabe for Comme des Garçons 2002-3 jacket, in which it looks like it's haphazardly done, but in fact perfectly or really complicatedly constructed and tailored to create this very unique silhouette from recycled blue jeans. A subsection of the interactive garment included a dress by Takezo Toyoguchi from 1982, where you could basically on your own transform your garment from long sleeves to short, from neck line or no, from belting. An Issey Miyake dress from his Plantation label that you could wear 6 different ways, and we showed a series of photographs on the platform of the different ways, and in the background or on the right, a blouse covered with multiple buttons and buttonholes, so you could actually change your silhouette whenever you put it on. In the materials section, we covered various designers and juxtaposed old with new. So here you see on the left a 1920s silk pleated Delphos dress by Fortuny, and on the right a polyester pleated dress from Issey Miyake's Pleats Please artist series which shows a figure drawing by or sketch by the American artist Tim Hawkinson. Also, here we have Issey Miyake's Pleated Wave series from fall/winter 93-94, in which we really took the cue of the mounting shape from the actual garment itself, and also played with it in terms of really throwing it up on the wall, so it wasn't just as eye level with everything else. Here we have, also in the materials section, a faux fur dress by Norma Kamali, 1988, of synthetic fur. The 2 black garments are by Yoshiki Hishinuma from his 1998 fall-winter series, in which he uses polyurethane and nylon on the left and polyester plain weave laminated with urethane on the right. And of course, behind them are 3 textiles by Reiko Sudo of Nuno to kind of illustrate and some of the new technology in textiles at the time. And then here is her very large, special produced, I think, large series of her origami pleats from 1997, which is a polyester plain weave with heat set folds and transfer print. And we used it on the platform shown with Rei Kawakubo's cape and paper skirt from spring-summer 1997 and Issei Miyake's POW coat, spring-summer 95, polyester plain weave applique and pleated and heat and pressure set coat. In the form section, we have sort of the geometric shapes of Issei's, from Issei's early collections of the printed dress on the triangular side. We were lucky enough to have 2 circle dresses, so we put one flat on the wall and then showed how it was worn in dimension. And then on the right, upper right is his futon coat flattened out, which becomes a very elegant short jacket, and his staircase or zigzag dress from 1994-95. The final was concept, and we showed various areas of, or selections, juxtapositioning, and this was from the trench coat series. We have on the left Christian Bailey for Burberry, who kind of decides to cut the coat and make it a midi coat, basically, which totally goes against what the use of a trench coat is for in terms of protecting the body. In the middle is Junya Watanabe, where for the jacket, he takes the belt and puts it on the up along the shoulders. The epaulettes are down at the cuffs, and the skirt is made of multiple trench coat collars to create a very sassy kind of swinging skirt. And then on the right is Martin Margiela's deconstructed trench coat of spring-summer 2006. And then finally, at the end of this concept section was we happen to have the entire, or samples from the entire collection of Issei Miyake's guest artist series that included the artists Yasumasa Morimura, Nobuyoshi Araki, Tim Hawkinson, and Saigo Chiang. When the exhibition opened, we didn't have a catalog, but the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence, Italy wanted to travel the show, and so because of that, they got Skira Publications to do a book both in English and in Italian. And then, so that was lovely. And then in 2010, with Fashioning Fashion, European Dress in Detail, we celebrated a groundbreaking acquisition of a major collection of European women's, men's, and children's dress from 1700 to 1912. And it was not only a celebration of that major acquisition, but it was also it was one of 3 exhibitions that inaugurated the debut of the Linda and Stuart Resnick exhibition Pavilion at LACMA, which was designed by Pritzker Prize-winning architect Renzo Piano. The exhibition design was by Italian opera director, set and costume designer Pierluigi Pizzi. And the exhibition, or the conceit that he had, was that this was a new collection that we were simply unpacking and putting on display, when in fact it took months and months to dress this, and another month to install it. But nonetheless, here you have the timeline section of women's, and we chose to do it all in white, basically, so that people can concentrate on the changing silhouette. And then here's the men's timeline, which surprisingly was very colorful. We often think of menswear as being just dark gray, navy, and black. And then we have the textile section, which included a lot of interesting textiles, such as this banyan made for the Western market, but made of Chinese silk damask. And then a section on tailoring, which showed the different tailoring techniques of the changing fashionable silhouette over several hundred years. And the last was trim, which we kind of call the icing on the cake, where it showed a lot of embroidery trim. This was a beautiful Spanish court gown of black satin that was totally embroidered with gold thread. And then when this finished, Les Arts Décoratifs in Paris wanted to travel the show there, but first it went to the Deutsches Historic Museum in Berlin, which really validated the price we paid for this collection. And the collection, we already had a very strong European collection, 18th, 19th century collection, primarily, but it was primarily American and British, and this particular collection really strengthened sort of the French and Northern European styles, and then also just raised the bar of the collection to an international level. In 2011, we received a gift from the Rodarte label. These are a brand designed by sisters Kate and Laura Malevi. They're based in LA. They did a special project for Pitti Uomo in Florence, and I think they had gotten a lot of their main clientele, wealthy clienteles, to help fund that project, and then in the end, they decided to donate it all to the museum. This is they called it the Fra Angelico collection. The collection was inspired by Italian art, of course, specifically the Renaissance frescoes in the monastery of San Marco by Fra Angelico in Florence, Italy, as well as the Baroque sculpture Ecstasy of St. Teresa by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, which is in Rome. Because this was a total surprise donation for us, I decided to do a pop-up installation and decided, of course, there was, our exhibition schedules planned to the hilt for years, but decided and got the permission from the director and the European Painting and Sculpture curator was not so enthusiastic, but I decided that it would be great to put it in our Florentine galleries, and it was just beautiful the way that you could see the inspiration that they had from her collection, because as you move around, you see all the colors of the dresses shown in the paintings and the ceramics. There was particularly a large painting that you see behind that was painted and really was interesting because it was a painting that was dedicated or paid for by silk makers before it was donated to the church. But here you can see, as you move around the golden platform, how the colors work beautifully in the collection. And the thinking about this was when my director and I approached my colleague, who was not so fascinated to have fashion in his galleries, our director, who was really great, said, well, why wouldn't you want it? Because you bring a whole different audience. These are permanent collection galleries that are static, that have been hanging for probably most of the curator's career, and all of a sudden you have this as a real destination point for fashionistas, young people, and all of that, and indeed the traffic increased in the gallery. And then in 2018, the entire collection was included in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Heavenly Bodies Fashion and the Catholic Imagination exhibition. In 1988, LACMA opened its Pavilion for Japanese Art, which was designed by architect Bruce Goff, who's an idiosyncratic visionary influenced by the organic designs of his mentor, American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who also designed the Tokyo's Imperial Hotel and was himself a real collector of Japanese art. The East Galleries, which you show here, was designed to display traditional Japanese screen and scroll paintings, but is also a perfect venue to show Japanese textiles. The first show I did of textiles was primarily indigo-dyed cotton textiles of the Mingei movement, which look gorgeous here. And this was an exhibition in 2014 called Kimono for a Modern Age, which highlighted a recent collection that we built of Meisen kimono, which is a kind of first half of the 20th century phenomena. And let me go back here. You see that the display areas are these faux kind of tokonomas that you see in a traditional Japanese home. It was large enough to hold 3 kimono in each bay. So the way I curated the show was to really focus on the designs. Again, with kimono, it's really the motifs. The form doesn't change, but the motifs and the designs do. So these are 3 examples of 3 kimono that were in one tokonoma, where I showed the traditional kind of wave and seafoam pattern, but albeit kind of Art Nouveau, inspired by Art Nouveau. In the middle, you have a deconstructed, very abstracted sea waves and sea foam against a geometric background, which I believe is very much like inspired by Art Deco. And on the right, a very contemporary multi-polka dot kimono, and polka dot Western dresses and textiles were very popular in the Taisho period of Japan, around 1920s. And then here's a series of 3 others in the mesa and kimono, which I thought were all inspired by modern art. You have the influence of fauvism, very colorful, non-naturalistic colorations on the traditional landscape. You have a surrealist-inspired landscape in the middle, and then abstract expressionism, almost looking at Paul Klee. In 2015, we had a campaign to purchase a major collection of African textiles from Brussels collectors Marcel and Zaira Mies. So we put up a small exhibition showing the splendor or the richness of this particular collection in hopes of doing fundraising salons and walking through. And in the end, the entire collections of sub-Saharan textiles and costume was purchased in honor of LACMA's 50th anniversary. It also included not only costume, but accessories, amazing hats and belts. We decided to, in a inner room, to display our Elanatsu fading scroll piece, and just around the corner, this is Elanatsu's piece, which is made up of aluminum liquor bottle caps and copper wire, and constructed very much like kente, traditional kente cloth. And we showed a beautiful example around the corner. And in fact, Elanatsu's family, particularly his father and brothers, actually made kente or wove kente cloth. He claims that that didn't influence his art, but that you can think about that yourself. In 2016, the European collection featured in Fashion also included a real amazing cache of menswear from the 18th and 19th century. We decided, therefore, there was enough there that we hadn't shown there to do a history of menswear, one of the first major menswear exhibitions, and decided at the same time to beef up our 20th century collection very thoughtfully. This is the exhibition design. It had thematic, and it was in the Broad Contemporary Art Museum galleries, which had very high ceilings. We had Commune, a local design firm, design it, and they did this nice thing of bringing down the high ceiling with cornices, and each thematic section had a color scheme. And actually, go back here, this was the Revolution Evolution, which was primarily a thematic section. East-West looked at the influence of exotic lands on Western fashion. And this was the Japanese section, where you had both Japanese immigrants from Hawaii doing Hawaiian shirts, and then also the tombi, which was influenced by the Inverness Scottish coat, but then was worn with a big, made with big armscye that accommodated the kimono sleeve that were worn by intellectuals and artists during the Taisho period. And then Yoji Yamamoto's jacket, which when we looked under his armscye, it was also very large. Uniformity, looked at the, started off with military uniforms, and it were really the tailors of the military that started Savile Row, basically. And we looked at, here's a section looking at camouflage, where we have an early tank suit that was hand printed to look like it was brush printed, which the original tank suits were. And then in the middle is a down ensemble and a down coat that was totally made up of feathers, colored in various camouflage feathers. And then Jeremy Scott's camouflage, and if you want to hide from anything, you'd have to be in a bowl of jelly beans to hide yourself. There was a section on body consciousness, which we looked at the different ways that men have cinched either through tailoring or shown transparency. This is a section on the various change of swimwear, including a Ray Kawakubo and a Speedo collaboration on the laser suit that broke so many records in competition that was banned from the Olympic Games. And also the last section was A Splendid Man, which included sort of questioning, what is masculine? And you have on the right a Ray Kawakubo, just normal suit, but totally covered with lace. In the middle, Rick Owens puts a man dress on and basically with a traditional men's blazer. And then on the left is a Middle Eastern designer that took his key from traditional dress there. And then we had a tattoo artist actually tattoo the arm or hand sketch the arm of the mannequin. And then finally, this year we had my associate curator did the Power of Pattern Central Asian ikat from the David and Elizabeth Riceboard collection. These were all a collector that I had been looking at for decades, and he's now in his 90s, and so was finally willing to donate most of his collections. And this was done in the Resnick Pavilion, a very contemporary space. You see, I think, kind of the change from the earlier pictures I showed of fashion, where we use a lot of color, and now a lot of it seems to be very contemporary in its style, and particularly in an art museum, I think. And here you see the lozenges of the ikat garments that actually inspired the exhibition designer to make his platforms in this shape to mimic the motifs. And Michael, our director, came up to me and said, I've gotten more phone calls about this exhibition. People really excited about it, knew nothing about ikat, and it turned out that during its venue at LACMA, it had over 100,000 visitors, which I think was very much convincing us all that textiles belong in an art museum context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. That was eye-dazzling, especially the ECAT in the end. And thank you very much for that generous presentation of spanning so much of your career and the breadth of your experience. Thank you for sharing. Next up, we have Yaroslav Volovat, curator at the Moscow Museum of Contemporary Art. Please join me, Yaroslav. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be in this august assembly of brilliant minds. So I'm going to talk about the Fabric of Felicity, the international project showcasing clothes in art outside the context of the fashion industry. Curated by Valentin Diakonev, Katya Lazareva, and myself, this exhibition spanned 5 continents and featured over 40 artists, including representatives of historical avant-gardes, members of the Soviet and Brazilian underground art scenes, and new generation artists from Russia, Japan, USA, Zimbabwe, and other countries. The title of the exhibition hails from Jeremy Bentham's treatise, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1780, in which the philosopher argues that the path to a just social structure, the fabric of felicity, lies in a universal utility principle. Benson's utilitarian philosophy proposed the shortest and most rational route to cure society's ills is being to subjugate pleasure and pain to power. He posited the principle of utility that produces what he called the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Felicity in this case being the level of happiness of a given society. Fabric and textile work in general have been used as metaphors for social life at least since Plato. And in this exhibition, the physical part of dress was always considered to be utilitarian and anonymous. Uniforms, for example, are generally considered to be utilitarian and anonymous, and some avant-garde projects of the 1920s equated utility and felicity. In contrast, non-professional clothing is widely regarded as a symbolic act of self-expression. The fabric of felicity is the result of a thought experiment. What happens when we erase fashion from the conversation between garments and art? What kind of questions arise when there is no common ground where art and clothes habitually meet? The exhibition is based on an understanding of clothes as an offline avatar. In many ways, the choice of avatar is beyond the wearer's control. For the act of dressing, the humans are connected to industries that dictate style and behavior and depend on resources used in the creation of garments. Several layers of economic and political histories are activated by the simple act of putting something on. The philosophical foundation of this experiment can be found in German sociologist George Simmels' classic essay on fashion, 1905. He outlines two types of existence for garments. One is based on equality and tends to operate in societies close to communism or during traditional ceremonies such as those associated with mourning. The other provides a feeling and a look of unity for different social strata. Simmel likens unity to a painting's frame. It marks the internal coherence of a group and creates borders that exclude the other. Both equality and unity in dress rarely exist as such, but a good example of their confluence is uniform, a subject of many works in the exhibition. Uniform marks those who wear it as representatives of certain traditional institutions, medical personnel, the military, etc., and creates clanship when those in uniform position themselves close to sources of power. Global trade routes and the production cycles of raw materials, fabric, and ready-to-wear garments, the Silk Road of 21st century help define the geography of this exhibition, which is based on research veering from Stockholm to Dhaka, from Ivanova, which is in Russia, to Biella in Italy, along the way debunking the stereotypical notions of East and West, the global North and South, and affirming the fundamental equality of artistic techniques, methods, and traditions around the globe. As a result, the principles of working with the material emerge as more important than national or cultural borders. One brief word about the exhibition design, since we're talking about staging of textile. The aesthetic impulse here was that of the sad feeling of an abandoned shopping mall, a sad retail, so to say, romanticizing and lyrical. The breadth of the topic necessitated the physical expansion of the exhibition outside the museum's main exhibition spaces. The fabric of felicity started in the museum's cloakroom with a special commission by Swedish artist Bella Rune. Following a research trip to Ivanova, the center of early Soviet propaganda textiles, the artist used augmented reality to develop an app that activates a virtual unfolding of endless ornamentation. The exhibition also extended to Garage Bookshop, where Swedish artist and theater director Marie-Louise Ekman created a limited edition of series men's shirts with original drawings that reproduce in the comic book manner Ekman's is known for, a person's biography through important everyday objects. Another exhibition design feature was the labeling, replacing the conventional museum labels with clothing tags that indicate the origin of work, as well as its site of production. The exhibition emphasized networks that are subdued to the forces of capitalism and pointed out the ambiguity of the system we're part of. Okay, now I'm gonna quickly go through the focal points of the show. The first one is the circulation of objects. Beyond the context of fashion as a work of art, our understanding of clothing is closely connected to the fabric of everyday life, particularly within the sphere of the circulation of objects. In a then new project by Narda Alvarado, a sweatshirt with the logo of an American university, a hot commodity in Bolivia's flea markets, becomes the uniform for students from the university in Varisara, a town largely populated by the indigenous Aymara people. Yuichiro Tamura, who actually invited me to participate in this conference, so put a word forward for me, used the bomber jackets with traditional Japanese embroidery, a product of the Korean War, which are known as sukajan, short for souvenir jacket, to reveal the multi-layered identity of post-war Japan. Bomber jackets with dragons and Mount Fuji were popular with American soldiers stationed at military bases in Japan. After the withdrawal of the US armed forces, they became a fashion statement of the Japanese working class and later of the Yakuza. As part of the Swedish duo Golden plus Cenebis piece, Standard Length of a Miracle, fashion designer Tigran Avetisian curated work clothes for the museum invigilators from things left behind in the dry cleaners of Moscow and St. Petersburg. While for her project Second Hand, Ukrainian artist Zhanna Kadyrova sewed a dress from the tiles decorating the interior of the museum. And in this sense, the museum we are in right now is also second-hand because it's a 1968 Soviet restaurant that is repurposed as a museum building nowadays. So now I'm going to briefly talk about the speculative conception we put forward in this exhibition, which is called Krishna Capitalism. And for that, I will tell you a little story. One episode from the Indian Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, a colossus of world literature. It tells the story of Draupadi, the wife of 5 brother princes who are involved in a bloody struggle with a kindred royal dynasty. The eldest of Draupadi's husbands loses his wealth, the kingdom, his brothers, and they share its spouse to a cunning opponent in a dice game. The villains drag Draupadi into a gambling hall by the hair and ruthlessly begin to tear off her clothes. Krishna heeds to the victim's entreaties and turns into an infinite length of precious cloth to cover her. She remains undefiled. The sacred incident of the endless sari from an ancient epic can be interpreted as a metaphor for the current state of the textile industry in South Asia. There is one correction, however. The supreme power producing infinite fabric is no longer Krishna, but capitalism. The processes governing our appearance, both macroeconomic and symbolic, can be described by the said speculative concept of Krishna capitalism, in which the Indian god Krishna and capitalism as a social formation each play a significant role in the global circulation of looks and clothes, dictating colors, cut, and working hours. They're both complicit in overproduction of textiles, either as a woman's guardian deity in the case of Krishna, or as a driver of fast fashion's ubiquity in the case of capitalism. And in the situation of contemporary textile industry, their invisible hands are both morally ambiguous. The juxtaposition of an Indian folk painting based on India's main epic poem, the Mahabharata, and a massive textile sculpture by American artist Beverly Sams is just one example of the already mentioned crossing of cultural borders. Such cross-cultural outreach is necessary work in the context of Russia, where identity politics tends to be based on uncritical Occidentalism or sentimental Orientalism. So we had a task carved with the scenes of Mahabharata to illustrate the said subject and an excerpt from the video. And now I would like to quickly show you this excerpt from the popular Indian 94-episode adaptation of the Mahabharata, directed by Ravi Chopra. This is the tusk carved with the same scene, which is called Draupadi ka Vastraharan in Sanskrit, or Chirharan, or taking off the clothes from Draupadi.
जो स्त्री 5-5 पुरुषों के साथ रहती हो वो पत्नी नहीं, वेश्या होती। और वेश्या का मान क्या और अपमान क्या? ये यहाँ नग्न भी लाई जाती, तब भी अनुचित ना होता। बैठ जाओ। मेरा मित्र बिल्कुल ठीक कह रहा है।
एक वेश्या या दासी का मान क्या और अपमान क्या? दुशासन, मेरी इस दासी को नग्न कर दो। देखूं तो सही कि जिस दासी को मैंने जीता है वो लगती कैसी है।
दुशासन, यदि तूने पांचाली के
Five
वस्त्र
husbands
को
of
हाथ
Draupadi.
नहीं लगाया तो क्षत्रिय गर्मा की सौगंध तेरे हाथ तोड़ दूंगा।
फिर अपनी 5 पतियों वाली पत्नी से कहो कि अपने वस्त्र स्वयं उतार दे, और यदि उसने ऐसा नहीं किया तो फिर मुझे हाथ लगाना पड़ेगा। चल उतार अपने वस्त्र। अरे उतार। इधर छाती कहाँ है? चल इधर। आ इधर। छोड़ दे मुझे।
हे गोविंद, हे द्वारिकाधीश, हे सर्वशक्तिमान, हे योगेश्वर, मेरी लाज बचा गिरधारी। हे कृष्ण।
खींच दुशासन, नग्न कर दे इसे।
हे कृष्ण, हे कृष्ण। हे कृष्ण, 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 हे कृष्ण।
So I think we got the idea, right? Several of the artists examined these Krishna capitalist processes in politics and society through the prism of clothing and the textile industry, with the clothing itself often serving as a metaphor for the victims of humanitarian or ecological catastrophes. Examples of this type of work can be found in the installation by Bangladeshi artist Kamruzaman Shadhin, made with second-hand clothes collected from refugees, including Rohingya people. It's called Haven Elsewhere, and I think it has much in common with the works of the French artist Christian Boltanski, which are dedicated to the victims of Nazism. Or take Kader Atiyar's installation La Mer Morte, the Dead Sea, in which ready-made clothing in shades of blue and azure imitates the sea. This is an ephemeral monument to those refugees who died on their way to Europe from Libya. Over the last few years, the Mediterranean Sea has become a dead sea, or rather the sea of the dead. The struggle for rights for workers in the textile industry, a problem that has waxed society since the middle of the 19th century, often appears as the subject matter in projects at the intersection of art and political activism. Alice Kreischer and Andreas Zickman used the visual means of infographics to compare the strikes of Indian textile workers in 1982 with the boycotts of Italian factories in the 1970s. The photographs of Vladislav Shapovalov depict flags with the names of workers from textile factories in the Italian city of Biella. One, you can see the long name, it's a conceptual gesture, it's all the name of the female factory workers that, are embroidered on the flag. One of them is actually Felicità, that translates as happiness or felicity, echoing the title of the exhibition. While the last work in this section by Taslima Akhter is a grim photo documentation from the site of the sewing workshop that collapsed in Bangladesh in 2013. It speaks to the fate of the newest victims of the fast fashion industry. The majority of the works presented in the show were located between two conceptual poles, the uniform and the universal form. The photograph of Candide Herfer captured museum restorers in their coveralls, protecting them from the sometimes literally toxic legacy of a colonial past. Farah Karapetyan, an Los Angeles-based artist, noted the near-universal attire of political activists, allowing those protesting in Egypt to sleep under the radar of the police. Taking a form reminiscent of a museum of natural history, Sharon Kivlin's installation cataloged and allegorized the dress codes from the era of the French Revolution, while in his video, The Street and Modern Life, the Dutch conceptual artist Hans Eichelboom blurred the boundaries between everyday attire and a uniform, while the Russian feminist duo, let me just slide through it, yeah. While the Russia's feminist duo Factory of Found Clothes confronted gender codes by having the uniformed cadets of the Naval Academy carry white dresses, a universal sign of the feminine, in their 2007 work, Triumph of Fragility. This is I'm sorry, I really went far away. Yeah, I have to go to that work, yeah. This is the Triumph of Fragility by Russia's feminist duo Factory of Found Clothes. I just want to draw your attention that it was made in 2007, a work that wouldn't be possible in today's Putin's Russia. Going back to this piece. In Seeing Through Clothes, the fashion historian Anne Hollander writes, much ethnic dress or folk costume has the quality of reducing the wearer to a symbol-bearing abstraction. In the work of Egyptian artist Mu'taz Nasser, we see three dervishes whirl, throwing out their arms and then pressing their hands to their chests. The Sufis are shown from above. Their ritual uniform, unfolded in a single plane, forms a circle, a universal form capable of representing great impersonal forces, be it God, the orbital motion of the planets, gravity, or infinity. The search for universal form is something that has fueled the historical avant-garde as well as post-war abstraction. The fabric of felicity surveyed major developments in the avant-garde's experiments with textile, from the formulation of a rational outfit unfettered by fashion trends to new geometric patterns for fabric. Lyubov Popova and Varvara Stepanova saw in such developments an egalitarian potential far removed from the kingdom of flowers and paisley patterns of the old world with its rampant inequality. Avant-garde experiments with total uniform and its connection to the notion of universal form in post-war abstraction are best exemplified by Divisor, a performance first organized by Brazilian artist Ligia Pape in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro in 1967, on the eve of the abolition of an already authoritarian constitution. Pape invited children from the favelas to walk the streets of Rio de Janeiro in a procession. The artist covered the children with a huge white cloth, the slits in which divided the crowd into single faces. Anyone could join the carnival of the disenfranchised. Divisor offered the opportunity to withdraw from the public space strictly regulated by the junta and into a zone of creative autonomy, albeit for a short while. This social sculpture made from white cloth and dedicated to human freedoms can rightly be considered part of the worldwide movement against the oppression and inequality. And as part of the exhibition, we recreated the piece as with the original, and you can see it here in the park where the Garage Museum is located. And as with the original performance half a century ago, participation was open to everyone, and we invited visitors to join the procession along the park riverbank, which ironically overlooks the Russian Ministry of Defense. And in the back, you could see a church. This is the notorious church where the Pussy Riots intervention took place. Okay, good. This is the park. This is also in the park. In the sketches of Ellsworth Kelly, you would see one can observe the opposite impulse, a progression not from abstraction to clothing, but rather from clothing to abstraction. Both vectors converge in Alexandra Galkina's painting series called Skirts. Okay, clothing as a medium for engaging in conversation with one's ancestors and the spirits was one of the focal points for artists working with chthonic fashion. Artists who use textile and clothes as a medium to address the wisdom of previous, often pre-modern generations. Lydia Masterkova built her palace from fabrics found in destroyed churches and her grandmother's trunk, creating a spiritual reality parallel to Soviet modernization, literally from scraps. In the work Siguapa Pantera, Firelei Baez addressed the mythology of her home country, the Dominican Republic, while Haif Kahraman turned to traditional Persian and Arabic miniatures to understand her own identity on the front lines of social and political unrest in a globalized world. Here is Portia Zvavaheris' painting, where she brings symbols from the mythology of India and Zimbabwe together under a single veil of translucent fabric. Combining offcuts of cloth left by her grandmother with colorful dresses from her mother's wardrobe and clothing made for her using old patterns and vintage fabric, the Russian artist Anastasia Bogomolova aimed to understand the notions of the body and sexuality inherited from previous generation and to recognize herself in them, reconstructing the beauty ideals of past eras. These works about the legendary past and mythological creatures were joined by a photograph by South African artist Ati Patraruga, depicting a grotesque image of a future citizen of the utopian country of Azania. A separate small section of exhibition was dedicated to the birthday suit or the naked costume. Nudity is an expression of vestimentary codes. According to fashion historian Anne Hollander, in European culture, nudity was accepted as a special type of attire, a visual extrapolation of with native honor clad. An ironic variation of this outfitting could be found in the works of Huguette Calan, Katalin Ladik, Soviet conceptual artists Rima and Valery Girlovin, and highly stylized shot by Jimmy DeSana. The political aspect of nudity was explored in the photographs of Pedro Valtierra, capturing the naked strike of Mexican miners, which took place in 1985. On the last day of the exhibition, artist Anastasia Potemkina, who created the exhibition design, recreated Cut Piece in 1964 performance by Yoko Ono, which invited audience members to come up on stage and cut off a piece of the artist's clothes. Exploring the notion of personal space and aggression, Cut Piece was at the same time a form of protest against the war in Vietnam. At Garage, the famous performance was reinterpreted as a distribution of gifts or kind of fabric potlatch, with the performer wearing a dress made of African cotton fabric. This printed batik from Senegal has a complex history. In the 19th century, the Dutch colonizers organized the industrial production of cloth imitating traditional Indonesian, mainly Javanese batik, but the innovation didn't take hold. The entrepreneurs were forced to export their invention from Indonesia to West Africa, where the colored fabrics quickly gained popularity and subsequently became a symbol of the national struggle for independence. This dress featured a bright Chintamani wax print. You can see the performer here. This dress featured a bright Chintamani wax print. Chintamani, which in Sanskrit means a diamond bringing fortune, emerged in Buddhist art. And this pattern consists of 3 circles inscribed into a triangle, similar to Jacques Lacan diagrams of human psyche, where the 3 circles represent the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. In this fabric, the metaphor of the fabric of felicity takes shape. Speculatively speaking, the ornament is charged to bring fortune and contains the recipe of happiness, awareness of whatever happens on the 3 levels of the psyche. Every participant could take a piece of the wonderful fabric as a souvenir. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yaroslav, and for bringing to the fore these questions between textile and contemporary art, which are very interesting relationships that CHAT is always trying to explore, as well as international and regional histories. So thank you for that. And up next, we have Jackie, who is the curator of Asian fashion and textiles and Peranakan art at the Asian Civilizations Museum and Peranakan Museum.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to thank CHAT again for inviting me to come to speak about an exhibition that that happened this year at the Asian Civilizations Museum between June to September this year. So answering the question, how does the exhibition context of a textile reframe its interpretation? I present this case study at the museum. So just a quick overview of Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. We opened in 1997 and moved to the current building that you see here in 2003, and we began our revamp of the entire museum in 2015, and is completing it next year. And in terms of the mission of the museum, we have actually shifted away. When we first opened in 1997, we were much more, the approach to Asia was through a geographical approach. So we have galleries in terms of East Asia, West Asia, Southeast Asia. But now since we revamped in 2015, we are really looking much more on the historical connections between cultures of Asia and between Asia and the world. The museum, we have 3 floors. The first floor explore Asia through interconnected trade. The second floor on faith and beliefs. And the third floor is very much on materials and design. Particularly next year in March 2020, we will complete our third floor, in which there would be 3 sections on ceramics, jewelry, and fashion and textiles. And I would say that in terms of ACM, there has been 3 phases or 3 layers to collecting and curating Asian fashion and textiles. So from the early period, as I mentioned, when we opened in 1997, we presented and collected Asian fashion and textiles from a geographical approach, so much more looking at textiles from according to how they represent these different textile regions. But from 2015, we look much more at emphasizing cross-cultural connections, and with this exhibition, we are trying to look a lot more at textiles as clothing or as fashion. So a bit about our partner, of course, in this exhibition, Guo Pei, of course, is very much China's leading couture today. She's very well known for the quality, particularly of her embroidery. And the quality of her embroidery is, of course, the reason why she is the only invited Chinese guest member today on the very esteemed Chambre de la Haute Couture, which is the French trade association for it's a very exclusive association, of course, for the best couturiers around the world. And as part of that membership, she, of course, have to set up an atelier in Paris. So she's based in Beijing with an atelier in Paris today, and shows her couture works twice a year during Paris Couture Week. She is particularly known for her very dramatic and sculptural gowns that you'll come to see in the slides to come. And in these gowns, she often emphasized that she created them to reflect her artistic experiments with textiles rather than thinking about whether people would buy them. And she also, so in terms of her works, she divides them into 3 types. One, of course, that she makes for her clients, as I mentioned, but in this exhibition and what she focuses on the runway, she calls them her artistic experiments with textiles. And finally, the third section of her works is very much her bridal line that she started in 2012. And a bit about the background of how we came to work with Guo Pei. The origins of this collaboration actually arose from 2 wedding dresses in our collection that she responded with directly in her works. And the 3 reasons I would think why we actually work with her at the museum is, number 1, again, emphasizing that shift in the museum to exhibiting more on Asian fashion in ACM. And secondly, we want to consider much more the contemporary in civilizations, that Asian civilizations does not have a historical break. And finally, I think it's our continued commitment to present to present Asian arts of remarkable craftsmanship. As mentioned today, she's very much regarded as the leading couture for embroidery from China. It's a prelude, again, as I mentioned, to the opening of our permanent galleries in March. So I think some of you might have heard that of other museum displays or exhibitions on Guo Pei's works. So this is just a summary of where you might have seen or heard her works before. And how I think every museum so far has given a different spin to her works. The first time I think her works were displayed in a museum context was at the China National Silk Museum in Hangzhou in 2012, whereby her works were displayed together with other Chinese contemporary fashion designers and explored much more the question of what is Chinese fashion today and what is Chinese style today. She broke, of course, very much into the international scene in 2015 when two of her works were displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the exhibition China Through the Looking Glass. So this is from that display and from that exhibition. And that exhibition actually focuses much more on Western designers, Western fashion designers' interpretation of China. And her examples were one of a few rare examples of Chinese designers reacting to China itself. And this Guo Pei Couture Beyond, it's the first mid-career fashion retrospective on her works, and that's the exhibition curated by Sketfesh Museum in Atlanta. It has traveled to a number of venues. It takes much more the narrative or the storyline of a conventional fashion designer exhibition, which is in a way a chronology of her style. And in 2017, this is the exhibition that took place in Melbourne as part of the Triennale there. They selected particularly a recent collection of hers called the Legend Collection. And in that storyline in that museum, it looks much more at her works in terms of contemporary art. So for the ACM exhibition, we were committed from the start to do something different. And our storyline focuses very much more on a dialogue between historical and contemporary Chinese design, juxtaposing 29 of her embroidered works with 20 of our Chinese masterpieces at ACM. The show takes the format of 3 sections. The first section looks at her Chinese bridal dress collection highlights, and we compare it with her inspirations from our Peranakan collection. The second section would be much more on her dresses on the runway, and we juxtapose that with our collection of Chinese export art. And finally, the third section talks about how her works that are particularly made of her signature Go embroidery technique, we parallel that with our collection of Chinese art with imperial associations. So it's really much more about how one couture reference and reimagine Chinese aesthetics and tradition for China and the world today from one designer's perspective rather than being a 101 or comprehensive understanding of China. So an introduction to the introductory space to this exhibition, we wanted actually to start with a teaser, with something that people expect to see of a Guo Pei show, because many people came thinking that it's a fashion retrospective. So we have this teaser whereby, of course, people must see the Rihanna gown, of course. So we wanted to showcase that moment. It's what we call Guo Pei in the fashion world, so it totally breaks from the entire exhibition later. And so you come and you see, wow, this is of course the Rihanna dress that made her famous internationally. So this gown called Yellow Queen, of course, we want to capture the historic moment, 4th of May 2015. I would think that definitely I think is important to represent not just for our personal career, but also because today it's still very much seen as one of the best all-time Met Gala gowns. The Met Gala, of course, is seen very much as the party of the year for its very strong attendance among celebrities and for glamorous fashion. This gown, worn by Rihanna, as you could see, was on the cover of Vogue US the very next day. So it produced, of course, a slew of memes. And the fun fact behind this was that Guo Pei always said that she didn't know who Rihanna was when Rihanna asked to borrow the gown. And so she tried to dissuade Rihanna, like, you might not want to wear this dress because it weighs 25 kilograms. because of the very extensive embroidery and the materials that she used. And she said, my own model couldn't finish the walk on the runway, so we had to kill the lights. And she had to help off the runway. But Rihanna said, convinced her that she could do it. And of course, the rest, they say, is history. And Guo Pei, today, she credits Rihanna for breathing new life back into this gown. Deliberately, I have chosen to have these videos that you see behind, 3 video screens. They look like this. And what I did was I selected images of the gowns that are in the exhibition to come. I wanted to show the visitors what Guo Pei saw. So in terms of museology, what we call the first lives of the object, what they actually mean to the fashion designer. For Guo Pei, she talks about how all her gowns have a particular spirit. So she would tell me that she chose all her models, that they must have a particular poise and a particular movement. It must come with particular accessories to complete this look that she imagined in her mind. So of course, this is a very drastic break from what you see in the exhibition to come, whereby we actually interpret her works much more in the context of the 3 sections that we talked about earlier. So the first section, actually, again, we tease the audience. We don't start actually with her couture works, but rather with her bridal dress selection, with her bridal dress line. So beyond her very personal creations on the runway, the search for a higher meaning and purpose had weighed on her. So about a decade ago, a woman actually from Hong Kong itself had asked Guo Pei for help to alter her mother's-in-law Chinese bridal dress for her daughter-in-law to wear for her upcoming wedding. So this woman had also worn the same dress for her own wedding. The request, therefore, to pass on the dress as a family heirloom and heritage inspired Guo Pei to launch her own bridal line in 2012. She said she shared often that although the Western white wedding gown, she recognized it as the global fashion standard today, she deeply believed that the Chinese around the world could try to embrace something more culturally specific for their heritage. So in terms of exhibition framing, I particularly talked with Guo Pei about showing how actually, interestingly, her first collection in 2012 is very much inspired by the diasporic Chinese in Southeast Asia. And secondly, how she reimagines particular Chinese wedding dress traditions. This is a photo of her studio in Shanghai, her showroom for her bridal line. And moving into the exhibition itself, we start with this pairing between the museum collection and Guo Pei's works to talk about how actually this exhibition collaboration began. The museum actually chanced upon a photograph of the celebrity actress Angela Baby that you see here on her actual wedding day in one of her wedding studio portraits. And actually, I felt instantly that Guo Pei must have seen a very similar Peranakan Chinese robe in our collection that was only displayed once before when we had a traveling exhibition to the Musée Quai Branly in Paris in 2010. So out of curiosity, I emailed her and sent her a photo of this and said, did you actually see this in our collection? And so she replied and she said, yes, I actually visited your exhibition in 2010. And she said she particularly liked the section on Peranakan weddings, Peranakan bridal dress, and she said she made not one, but 2 wedding dresses in direct response to what we had on display, and she said that the exhibition was influential in that very first bridal line collection that she launched. So we spoke very excitedly about reuniting the pieces, what she made in response to our collection, and so the exhibition concept and display format of pairings between our collection and hers came to be. In general, of course, the term Peranakan, I think Yanni has shared earlier, it actually refers to descendants of, for us, the term Peranakan Chinese itself, it refers to descendants of southern Chinese migrants and local women since the 16th century in island Southeast Asia, who developed a very distinctive hybrid culture by the 19th century. And on their wedding day, before the war, they generally wore wedding robes that were like that. This is exported from Shanghai, made in China, for the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, particularly Penang in this case. And the museum piece actually features striking lotuses and goldfishes And this bright orange color that for the Peranakans, they have a specific name for this orange. They call it the Penang orange. And Penang refer to a kind of nut that they chew for this very distinctively Southeast Asian habit of chewing bitter nut because it produced that particular kind of orange juice. So and also there's rabbit fur trimming at the edges, which for the Peranakan Chinese is a sign of fertility. But when I spoke to Guo Pei about her interpretation, of course, she said yes, what sparked her piece was because she really liked the central depictions of the goldfish and the lotuses. She said the goldfishes were the most lively that she had seen in gold thread embroidery. And she really liked the orange, but of course she said she liked it as a beautiful color without, of course, understanding the cultural significance it had for the Peranakans. And she influences is seldom linear. So what we have here is an early 20th century Chinese bridal style that was exported from China to the overseas Chinese, is given new life today by China's leading couture and worn by one of the nation's top celebrities today. So even in terms of the exhibition design, what you have behind here is a screen that is a stylized version of what you have in Peranakan homes today. So for us, it kind of represents a homecoming in terms of inspirations. This is the other piece that she made directly in response to what we have in the museum collection. So she really liked the vest or the xia pei. There's a Chinese saying called feng guan xia pei, meaning you wear the phoenix crown and this vest on your wedding day. And this term is in the Ming and Qing dynasty referred to how it used to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be able to wear a vest like this, because that was when you could wear this vest, which actually usually have significance with rank. But for the overseas Chinese, when you look at this, of course, Peranakans today say this is a traditional Chinese dress, but in that time, it was already, in a way, it's already a reinvention of tradition, because in China itself, they would have a rank badge, but over here, they have already instead asked for a pair of dragons, which is much more rare. So for Guo Pei, she said she really liked the vest, but she made it an open version of it with phoenixes instead of dragons. And also, I think, interestingly, you can notice there's multiple bands on the sleeves. And for that, she credit a Singapore Peranakan version in which there's always this multiple bands. So we actually did have a version of this in our collection, but due to space constraints, we didn't actually put out the other one as well. So her version actually combines two pieces in our collection into her piece. So Guo Pei often talks about how for her, Peranakan Chinese culture is like a gold thread flowing from Chinese culture, because during the Cultural Revolution, and she was born in the first year of the Cultural Revolution, which is 1967, so traditional wedding ceremonies and bridal dress, of course, were forbidden in that time, and wedding attire was simply your everyday best. So for her, it was the Chinese diaspora who maintained and further developed Chinese bridal dress traditions. So another particular aspect of Peranakan textiles that she liked, it's Peranakan beadwork, and you see a pair of slippers here that was also displayed during the exhibition in Paris. So what she particularly liked about Peranakan beadwork, it's how the surfaces are entirely decorated, and the beads that you see are really very fine and very delicate. So she said she tried, but she couldn't find. But since then, at the museum, we have told her some of the sources. So she couldn't find where to source these beads initially. She said if she knew where to find these beads, what you would be looking at here would be a fully beaded cheongsam or tipao. So what she did instead was to adapt that idea conceptually, but replace the beads actually with pearls. And the other piece that you see here also, she said was inspired by the idea of making a fully beaded dress, but because she didn't have it, she experimented with pearls in it. So this is what she called her pearl bridal gown, in which she used extravagantly over 250,000 pearls, in which the largest pearls you see, 30 of them, are South Sea pearls. So in this section also, I persuaded Guo Pei actually to have this section. She said she doesn't want to look like she's cashing in on her clients who are celebrities. But I told her actually that is an important point to make, because she's so well known for her couture works. But her bridal line is actually the one that is, in a way, I think really spreading the use or popularizing again Chinese bridal dress among the Chinese in China and abroad. So over here are three very well-known Chinese celebrities. For those of you who might know, from right to left, you have Michelle Chen Yanxi. In the center, you have Liu Shishi, and then on the right is Tang Yan. They were all weddings in the recent past 5 years. And I selected them not only to show how the celebrities actually really use this textiles or dress in actual ritual context. They use it usually for the wedding ceremony, the tea ceremony in the morning. But also because if you look at the way that she actually designed them, she's actually playing particularly with two kinds of traditional Qing Chinese costume, which is either in the center. I think this is much more a classic Southern Chinese, particularly in Hong Kong. You still find this style today. So this style is the Kwa style, which has a central opening, and then this is the Ao style with the side opening. So she continues to play with but she has changed the interpretation in terms of the silhouette and also the kind of techniques that she used to make them. In the second section of the exhibition, which is China and the World. Actually, since 2016, she brings her global vision with Chinese roots in her works to an international stage, as mentioned, particularly to her two Paris Couture Week runway shows a year. The large-scale production, actually by hand, of her works is done in a Rose Studio in Beijing, where she has over 500 artisans, making over about 1,000 bespoke pieces a year, in which only 10% is the pieces that you see on the runway. So she's very well known for this, for the thousands of hours that go into making her works, that they record, and that's why also, if you were looking at the slides, we do in this exhibition record the number of hours, and that has prompted interesting responses. Her works are also known to use a lot of traditional Chinese motifs, which but also at the same time she expressed them she also at the same time incorporate non-Chinese influences in her work. So the exhibition framing for this section was that we pair her works with our Chinese export art collection, in which we talk about how historically, of course, there have been a lot of, Chinese export art is historically hybrid to satisfy different markets, and fashion in Chinese export art history is, of course, one of exchange with China as a site of fantasy, open to interpretation and reinterpretation by others and the Chinese, like Guo Pei herself. So this is actually one of Guo Pei's most iconic works and one of two works that was displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2015. So by the 16th century, of course, China is seen very much as a leading global supplier of luxury products. And of course, blue and white ceramics is one of the most well-known products. In fact, ceramics became known as, of course, China itself. And what we displayed here is a rare piece in the museum collection. This is an early Ming Yongle period blue and white ceramic. And of course, when you think about this, this is seen very much as a Chinese, as Chinese art today, but the blue pigment that you see historically in blue and white ceramics actually came from the Middle East. So you can imagine the pigment coming to China, being refined and then exported. Particularly this design you actually find being collected in the Middle East. You still find it in royal collections in Iran and in Turkey today. So when I was talking to Guo Pei, when I saw this piece that she's very well known for, we talked about which piece to pair it with, and I suggested this piece. And of course, she also laughed because at a very basic level, there's that similarity in design of blooming flowers surrounded by bands of design, particularly that of swirling waves. But beyond that, what she was really trying to explore is, and think about, is really the method of producing ceramics in this piece. So in this exhibition, this is the only piece that is not, this is the only piece that is first hand-drawn and then hand-painted, rather than embroidered. It's actually painted, and then draped to resemble ceramic shards. And when you look at this piece, the fantastic thing is for the textile, it's actually decorated on both the inside and the outside, because she was trying to mimic ceramics that is what we call in and out ceramics, because it's decorated on both sides. And she was telling me excitedly that her teams actually spent 2 months trying to find what she calls a blue shade that is as close as possible to Ming period ceramics, and eventually they actually got the pigment that you see in this piece from Turkey itself. And another section of this, another part of this section, we look at the different Chinese symbolic motifs that she likes to use, and one of them is the dragon. And talking with her, I selected the dress, the golden dress with a much more Chinese dragon, and the red jumpsuit, actually, she said she was trying to explore the idea of Western dragons with wings. So I asked her, does she know that there's a difference in the meaning between them? And she said that, you know, Jackie, you're the historian. You should be the one who knows what's the meaning behind this Western symbolism. She said, for me, as a designer, I'm much more interested in the aesthetics of surfaces. So to me, she said she said when they are not Chinese designs, she incorporates them much more in terms of appreciating their aesthetics. So we have paired them with, for the golden dress, we paired it with, you can see at the top, this Chinese tongue cut. So it is made in China, but export for technically a European market. The shape of this cup is actually meant for drinking beer, but it's decorated with Chinese designs, but it's actually interestingly found in Singapore. It has the inscription Singapore Cricket Club, 1881, and I think it makes an interesting point that, of course, Singapore was a British colony, and we do have we did have a substantial market for this kind of silver even in Singapore. And at the bottom, you have a blue jar with this dragon with wings. So the jar was made in China and then exported to France, where the appreciation of Chinese ceramics in the 18th century was very strong, and for pieces that they really admire, they would add this kind of gilt mounts. For this pairing, it was much more a conceptual, in a way, exploration of this interesting conversation I had with Guo Pei. So for Guo Pei, her works have often been described as export wear re-imported and reinterpreted. So I tried to get to that here. So in Chinese export art, pavilions, so you see this pavilion in her corset dress, has often been used as a shorthand visual reference to Chinese landscapes in general. So I've asked Guo Pei, I said, when I look at this, so I asked her what's her inspiration for this, because it hardly looks like a classic Chinese calligraphy at all. And she said, actually, she would say that it really comes much more from Chinese export art and much more, in a way, Chinese art that would be described much more as Orientalist works of art. And she said that for her, she doesn't really make that distinction between Chinese art or Chinese export art. She said for her, she's much more interested to look beyond this kind of categories in creating her works. So to visually bring across this concept, we have here a kandi for Southeast Asian market made in China. But for Southeast Asia, again, you see this very stylized version of landscape. And this is the only item from our collection that is in this exhibition that is not from China. Rather, it shows how English ceramic makers were making their own versions of what they imagined China to be at that point of time. And this kind of ceramics was then influenced the way China was making like ceramics, because they were trying to compete for the same market. So in that sense, this was a much more conceptual pairing. And finally, this is another of our well-known works in which we pair with a Peranakan's ceramic. But I would skip the Peranakan reference because I've talked about it earlier. And finally, the third section is about, she has this coat, which she said, gold is the color of my soul. And just last year, there was an award-winning documentary on her called Yellow is Forbidden. I think it really shows, in a way, how yellow, the color, and also gold thread embroidery is very much, I think, a signature style of hers that reflects her background growing up during, actually, the deprivations of the Cultural Revolution. So I noticed that in her works, every collection, whether spring or summer, she always had a very bright yellow or golden gown. And so I talked to her about having this selection to be fully of the different kind of techniques she used in her gold thread embroidery, paired with our Chinese works of art. And I think for Guo Pei, she has, for her, She often talked about how growing up during the Cultural Revolution, of course, it was a time where luxuries were forbidden, and everybody were wearing the dress is politicized, of course, very much. Everybody wore almost the same clothes, or the most famous, of course, being the variations of the Mao suit. So growing up, she said she had to imagine fashion during the Qing dynasty, that as told to her by her grandmother. So when she was 10 years old, famously her mother, that was documented in this documentary, she asked her mother when she was 10 years old for a yellow dress, and her mother told her, no, yellow is forbidden, it's only reserved for the royal family, which is great irony because by that time there's no imperial family in China. So it shows, however, how strong the psyche is for a particular generation of Chinese. And so for Guo Pei, she said from then on, it really sparked in her the idea that one day if she were to be a fashion designer, yellow would mean something different for her. So the exhibition framing for this section talks about how the 3 iconic traits of Guo Pei style, which is the use of yellow, elaborate embroidery, and the lavish use of silk, really reflect, in a way, her imaginations of Chinese imperial art and design. And this is one of the key pairings in this section. She have often talked about how she's very much inspired by Chinese dragon robes. So I had a long discussion with her because in terms of Chinese dragon robes, there are actually many types. And so after a while, I realized that she's talking about this particular type, which is an auspicious robe made with very lightly for the emperor because of the design. With this kind of particular yellow called the Ming Huang, it's really reserved in that time for the emperor, and also the idea of the use of 5-clawed dragons and having 9 dragons in this cosmic design, whereby you have the dragons rising above the mountains and the seas among swirling clouds. So she said this has often influenced some of her interpretations. I would say that, so you can see here 2 mini dresses in which the one behind, she tries to use the symbolism of the 9 5-clawed dragons, while the one in front is inspired in terms of the composition of where she actually replaced the dragons with the Chinese character for double happiness, or C. But in terms of the silhouette, of course, you can see it's a far cry from what it used to be in the Qing dynasty, whereby, of course, the silhouette is much more loose, meant to conceal the body. And finally, we end the exhibition with actually one of her most iconic works. This is the other piece that was displayed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2015. When this dress was made, the technical mastery behind it made the China National Silk Museum in Hangzhou call it the birth of haute couture in China and a symbol of its time. Because of the complexities behind the embroidery. It actually required 50,000 hours to make it, 50,050, and still today, Guo Pei says she'll never repeat doing this because it took up so much time from her team. But when she was doing it, she said all her friends and people around her questioned her and said, why are you doing something that don't sell? And so she said she told all of them, I'm not making this piece to sell, I'm making this piece to keep. And for her, this was her own personal endeavor to try at that moment in time what they could produce, what she and her team, she said, could produce if there was no cash incentive, and also the idea of what she thought would be the most beautiful dress, exploring a question that she often think about, which is what is the most valuable use of your time? So she said that actually this, I would say, really represent her Guo Pei's rejection of fashion as fast and trendy, which is what, and also how she wants a more spiritual quality in her works. And she actually spent the first 10 years of her career doing ready-to-wear in major manufacturers in China, and she said her boss often tell her, can you make designs that use less thread and a lot less complex so that they could increase the profit margin. So she said she told herself one day if she actually can afford to have an atelier and do her own works, she would try to have works like that really, she doesn't really care what people think. She would do what she wants to do with an experiment with textiles. And for her, she said that time is life, and the production of it, she thinks it's a worthwhile experiment. And the other thing about this dress is that she wanted to think about the Buddhist concept of life and death, and so it was very much a strong use of the Buddhist symbol of lotuses. So we paired it with a loan from the Chris Hall collection of a 15th century tanka. And because I talked to Guo Pei, and there are actually 3 levels of associations that you can make with it. One, she told me how in training her textile embroiderers, she makes them look at old tankas like this. She has her own personal collection, and she makes them copy them before they actually graduate and do her original works. And when you walk into her atelier today in Beijing, you would see her hanging in her studio the pieces that are done by her team. So we wanted it to be a kind of like interesting reference to it, that when you walk in, you will see that pairing. And secondly, also, this is an image of the historical Buddha in his moment of enlightenment on the lotus. And finally, I think I was talking to Guo Pei and also sharing with her how actually, even from the Tang Dynasty, the imperial family would be gifting tankas like this to the temples because they believe that your accumulation of merit is equivalent to the number of hours that you actually spend to make textiles like this. So just in conclusion, again, this is not meant to be a fashion retrospective. It's beyond the designer's original intentions. We're looking really much more at connections between contemporary couture and historical Chinese objects. And we are very encouraged at the museum because when the exhibition closed in September, it's one of the 3 most visited exhibitions in the museum, and introduced us to a lot more younger audiences and many people who came to the museum for the first time. And particularly, I'm very encouraged by their feedback that it had given them a new way to look at ACM's collection. So I know I'm running over time, but thank you very much for listening today. I look forward to your feedback. Yeah, thank you.